This is Fab Four Free for All, the best Beatles podcast in the world. I don't have to listen myself because I'm Ringo Klaus, and I know everything there is to know about the Beatles. Go ahead, ask me anything there is to know about the Beatles. Ask me anything. Go ahead. Ask me how tall John is, and the answer come back 5'11". Ask me what George's shoe size is, and the answer come back 8. Ask me what 2 things Ringo hates, and the answer come back onions and Donald Duck.
And welcome to another edition of Fab for Free for All, the Beatles podcast on the internet that has been around in its current form for, as of this taping, wow, it's 14 years at this point.
Wow.
So
Wow.
Long time. And
feels like 30.
And for all of this time, I have and continue to be joined by my good friends, Mr. Mitch Axelrod.
Hey, folks.
And Mr. Rob Leonard.
Hello, everyone. How you doing?
And I'm your host and moderator of this episode. I'm Tony Chiguardo, and we're gonna go ahead and jump right in. It's been a while since I feel like since we've done a topic where it's just sort of us talking, giving our feelings and thoughts about a concept and an idea. And I was tossing this idea out, and I want to make sure that all of you realize that this is in no way meant to disparage the members of the solo Beatles. But the Beatles were such a huge, huge influence on culture, popular culture, and on the world, everything that they did. But when it comes to the 70s and the Beatles as solo artists, is the reality that as for solo performers, the Beatles really didn't have anything close to the type of cultural impact. And obviously, there are a couple of exceptions that we'll talk about right away that they had as a group. That whole idea, the sum being, the whole being stronger than the sum of its parts. So, given that as a concept, let's look at immediately post breakup. I know that Mitch and we've been bantering this around a little bit off mic, off screen. I know, Rob, I'm sure you've been giving this a lot of consideration, and we often talk about, the Beatles in the 70s. But any preliminary thoughts before we get into some detailed ideas?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I think we need to do what you and I had talked about off mic. We need to establish that there is or is not a traumatic event like a Kennedy assassination that would thrust a phenomenon, whether it's the Beatles or anything, it happened to be the Beatles, into the limelight where the world, quote, needed them, at least America. Okay?
Well,
go ahead.
Well, there were a number of different sort of traumatic type events, but part of it was that I think one of the biggest traumatic events was something that was ongoing. We had the Vietnam War. We had Watergate. There was plenty of, quote, trauma. There wasn't thank God, there wasn't an assassination. But we had a lot of, and let's face it, big national traumas don't always result in any kind of cultural phenomena happening. We here in America, we went through 9/11, and nothing really, I don't mean to trivialize 9/11. I mean quite the opposite. Heavily,
but culturally, it wasn't like
right.
A band showed up and said, "Okay, let's do this."
Well, there was,
Beatles
but again, different times. But one might argue, and where I'm going with that is, one might argue that the equivalent of the Kennedy assassination in terms of phenomenon, cultural happening in the 60s would actually be the Beatles breaking up in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Beatles breaking, hear me out, the Beatles breaking up left the door open, at least musically. I'm not saying, fashion and cultural. I'm just saying musically, the Beatles breaking up left the door open for everybody. And in my own opinion, and people will argue with this, nobody kicked the door down as explosively as the Beatles did when they had the opportunity 10 years earlier or 7 years earlier or whatever. Again, it's a debatable point.
Well,
I'm just saying, there was that opening by the Beatles no longer existing as a active band.
But
Yes,
if-
they existed throughout the 70s, and we'll get into some of that, which I think needs to get into, but they weren't. And I think nobody took the mantle of the Beatles and said, we got you.
But I think it's partly because that door had already been broken down in 1968 or so by the likes of what was going to start happening, which was, as you know, the heavy groups, man. It was Led Zeppelin, and Zeppelin wasn't 1970. The Beatles were still functioning when Zeppelin was an entity, and
Yeah,
it was the likes of the Zeppelins of the world that were going to take over the music industry at that point.
I,
So I don't
I,
know.
I think it's tough to compare what the solo Beatles did in the 70s to the 60s, because you're right, the four of them together is a lot more powerful than the individual things. But
Yeah.
also, the Beatles did so many things that, and I'll use the word you guys just use, kicking the door down, that once the door is down, everyone else walks through, and it's so different in the sense that how do you redo that? You can't. You can't.
Right. You
You know,
can't
put
shut the door again.
you can't put fix the door and say, okay, let's re-kick it.
That's a good point.
So I think part of it is, I think for the Beatles, that all four of them were successful, at least in the first half of the 70s. I mean, Paul's for the whole 70s, George most of the 70s, John and Ringo John retires and Ringo sort of slides away a little bit. But for the first 5 years, man, all four of them had hits, and not small hits, but big hits. No other band has broken up and then had hits like that. The Stones in the 80s, when they started to do solo albums, they weren't hits. But it was also a different time too. So, like when the Jerry and the Pacemakers broke up, none of those guys had hits.
Right.
Dave Clark.
Yeah, but nobody knew who the Pacemakers were.
Yeah, I know, but that's just part of it. They did have a following. They did, they did have something going on. I think the Beatles, if you think about the first 5 years especially, it's just incredible that each one had a number one hit, that they were on the charts, they were played on the radio, the new single got played for the most part, so to
But
me,
okay, I'm sorry.
so for me, it's tougher to say, is one part of the decade more important than the other? Obviously, the Beatles, they changed so much things, but you got to remember also, Revolver, it's hard to believe, didn't get the great reviews that everyone thinks it gets today when you look back on it.
Right. Right.
So
Right.
that's part of it too. So the acceptance of the Beatles led to other acts coming along, music acts, and even like just growing your hair longer. That comes out of the Beatles. So it's tougher because by the 70s everything gets established. Everything's established already. Okay, who's going to be the next? Beatles. Who's going to be the next?
Bingo,
Frank
right.
Sinatra.
Yeah. But to your point, it's interesting though, Rob, because when I was first thinking about and talking about this topic, it's that idea of, but the 70s, McCartney did Band on the Run. The Ringo album was huge.
Right.
George toured in 74, but it still came back down to that question of there were a string of successes, definitely, and there was a string of musical successes, but it was from that cultural standpoint. Now, one of the reasons why I keep saying that this is not meant to disparage them is the idea that it's more of, and we've already started doing this, it's more of a comparison of the 60s holistically as a decade and the 70s holistically as a decade. I mean, I said something to Mitch earlier, and it made me like quiver when I said it. It was like, you have the four Beatles in the 60s, and what the music did and the culture did and what their presence did and their personality did and stuff like that. And in the 70s, you had someone who we didn't even really know their personality. They wrote one song and it turned culture on its nose, no pun intended. And that was Van McCoy. I mean, the guy writes the song The Hustle and that comes out, and culture goes bat squat. Everything goes
Yeah.
nuts over disco and line dancing and dance and dressing flash, and it was mind-boggling that I found that were the 70s that shallow a decade.
Yes.
That right, that you didn't need something with the depth of the Beatles
Because to Rob's point, the Beatles had already established that depth. People then took that depth and went with it and kept it going, because you can't really build on the Beatles. You can't. And I'm not disparaging any other band ever, because every band is amazing in the 70s. Come on. We all know who they are. But you can't say anybody has ever really topped the Beatles. So they took, as Rob said, they went in the door, went through the door, and kept going through the room. I don't think any band really went further than the Beatles took it. They kept it status quo in a great space, but it's hard to really say, that the 70s were shallow. They weren't. There was a lot of great stuff going on, but I don't think the 70s
culturally shallow.
culture, yes. I don't think the 70s had as much, when I say tumult, going on as the 60s in general.
It was different. It was different, though.
Yeah, much different. The one thing I will say is, culturally, again, anytime a Beatle was anywhere in the 70s, it was still a happening.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Anytime. I mean, if you could get the Beatles on your show, or one Beatle, on your show, you made it, so to speak. Whether it was John Lennon appearing on the Sir Lou Grade thing, or Paul on Flip Wilson's show, or George on the disco show in 76, you still had a Beatle, and everybody tuned in because a Beatle was somewhere.
But to the point,
Yep.
Dick Clark shows the video of the Beatles doing Strawberry Fields on American Bandstand, and it's a culture shock that they have mustaches.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Because John was on the Tom Snyder show, was everybody running out and buying a Newsy hat?
no, but that
No.
was, it's different time.
Exactly.
Right.
I think one of the things about the 70s, if you want to look at the Beatles as this on the edge band, which they were, but in the 70s, on the edge bands, we'll say, came out of the CBGB crowd.
Yeah.
So you get Blondie and the Talking Heads, and Blondie had hits, and the Talking Heads didn't have hits until later on. But a band like Television and some other bands never made it because there was no radio station to play them. Radio had changed also, I think.
You hit another nail on.
And that's one of the things that gets me when you talk about music, because if a radio station isn't going to play it and get behind it and say, this is cool, or maybe you should go see this band, the way WNEW did, especially in the 70s, it's not the same. So, like we talk about the Beatles and you talk about disco, the hustle comes out, 6 months after Nixon resigns. And, the pressure of Nixon and that whole thing, that if you think of all the music that came out anti-Nixon or anti-war, it all stopped, when Nixon resigned in August of 74. So even John Lennon, sort of pulled away a little bit from his politics.
So Rob, is in a much smaller sense, is Nixon resigning the traumatic event like Kennedy assassination?
Some people have said that, because a lot of people have said that the 60s, if you want to cut it down, is from when Kennedy gets assassinated to when Nixon resigns. And the reason I say that is because they ran against each other in 1960, and plus they were kind of the opposite, even though they're probably more similar than people would say. But once those years, that 11 years happens, it's like you can't fight forever. You have to sit back. Oh, let's go dancing. Oh, we'll do the hustle. And then, they on the TV shows, this is how you do the hustle, adults. And, just like in the 60s and 62 or 61 whenever it was,
Twist.
for the twist, they showed adults how to do the twist, which is a great way to kill something, is make adults,
But isn't it
you know,
interesting though, Rob? Listen to the way that time scenario came out. What followed the twist fairly quickly? The Beatles. The
yeah,
Beatles go away. What happens? Another dance sensation. The only thing being that dance sensation arguably led to the opening of an entire disco subculture. The
right,
cultural effect.
right. Yeah,
And I think there are so many things. I was talking to someone about this topic today, and a comment was made that often gets made that the drugs were different in the 70s.
that's true.
Cocaine is not a I love you drug. It's not a let's all sit together and hug and look at a tree drug. It's a I'm Superman, and look at me, I can dance till 4 a.m. and not be tired, drug. And
Yeah.
from a culture standpoint, in terms of promoting group change, that is an element that's missing from the late 60s, from the and arguably too, did the Beatles sort of, the goal of the Beatles being able to empower yourself, be yourself, be who you want to be, nothing you could be that, nothing you can be that isn't where you're meant to be, nowhere you could be that isn't where you're meant to be, etc. Did the Beatles actually help to set up this idea of self that then took a little bit away from the collective consciousness years later that would have allowed another big cultural surge from a musical artist? So
Well,
a lot of weird go round there, really.
it's weird because no one in the 70s was singing "I'd Love to Turn You On." In the 70s and especially the 80s, they were singing cocaine. Eric Clapton was singing cocaine, but
Right.
he was singing about the drug. He wasn't trying to, how do I say this that it'll come out the right way? He wasn't trying to um have a different experience because of cocaine that would expand his mind in terms of songwriting. He was
Right.
just taking a drug
Right.
and writing about it. I mean, unfortunately, where the Beatles, when they took LSD and marijuana and everything, it only helped them to progress in a lot of people's minds. A lot of people like the early Beatles, so I'm going to say a lot of people's minds. But um, so it is so different. Um, and the Beatles didn't really, other than George in the 70s, I mean, the Beatles really didn't partake in a lot of cocaine. I mean, George admitted during the 74 tour when he weighed like 3 pounds and that he was doing a lot of cocaine. But they did, they had,
Not that we know of, but
yeah, yes, correct. But
Ringo
not,
had his own. Ringo probably was doing whatever was put in front of him. And
no, I think Ringo was doing the drink and
during a
then
toot and
Paul
a
was doing the
snore,
weed. Yeah.
during a toot and a snore, it's not like it was, it wasn't Ivory Soap that was going.
Listen, I'm sure there was a lot of it, but it wasn't like everybody knew what the Beatles were doing from 65 on. I mean, they told you in Help we would, totally stoned. And obviously all the drugs for Rubber Soul On, you knew it and you didn't mind because the music was so freaking good. In
But
the
Yeah, and
70s, I don't think a band made better music because they were enhanced on substance.
but part of it is, and I forgot who said this, but when you're taking a different drug, you make a different music. If you're on cocaine, it's like,
Yeah, I
you know,
guess.
and if you're on marijuana, you accept a 20-minute Santana solo. So, the Beatles didn't really
Carnival
do
of
the,
Light.
yeah, or Carnival of Light or Revolution 9 or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think part of it is just I think what happened was that the Beatles, they started out there, as John said, we're at the top of the ship in the lookout bin up there, and they did so many different things, and then other bands came along with them. So the White Album is the quirkiest album ever made. We've talked about, we could have easily made it a single album, but it wouldn't be the album, the quirkiness, which makes it even better album. So I think part of the whole thing is, the 70s, the Beatles grew up, as John said, because they broke up. And I think that, they went into music that maybe they wouldn't have done as a band. Plastic Ono Band, for the most part, wouldn't be as raw if it was a Beatle album, because maybe John wouldn't have felt comfortable doing it that raw in front of the other three, because he knows them forever. Paul, gets lost a little bit in his pop, of what he could do as an artist. Ringo actually comes up. Who knew Ringo was going to have all these hits? As
George did.
George did, but even John was like, I've got the interview, he said it, and he said, I was really happy that Ringo had hits.
No, I meant George did because he wrote them all.
Oh yeah, he co-wrote them. We'll say co-write them. And then of course George, George comes out with, All Things Must Pass, and Living in the Material World has become a much better understood album than maybe when it came out.
And again, like you say, musical successes.
Hang on.
But we'll go ahead. What were we going to say, Mitch? Because
I'm gonna say, because I'm glad you brought it up, Rob. Perfect segue. I'm going to say musically, George influenced a lot of players in the 70s with the slide guitar.
Yes, he did. He did.
Delaney Bramlett inspired George to play a slide. He never did it in the Beatles, but when he did it on starting with My Sweet Lord and going forward, and he didn't really continue it all throughout his solo career, but when he did it, a lot of people took notice, and a lot of people in the 70s and on were influenced by George's slide guitar.
And
yeah, I agree.
And after we spoke, we were talking about it, as I say, during the week as the show is coming forward. But interestingly, different Christian artists over the years, and I'm going to try to find the reference, but someone told me that even Bono was talking about the idea that George's an album like Living in the Material World is something that inspired them to not shy away from speaking their quote truths musically.
My Sweet Lord.
My Sweet Lord. But I think Living in the Material World is probably cited more because it's
yes.
more subtle. It's not. Yes, it has the Lord loves the one that loves the Lord, but it's a little bit more. It's not just simply saying my sweet Lord.
Right. You can't tell, like with George's songs, you can't tell if he's talking about God or his wife.
Yes, yeah, and I think that maybe on a cultural standpoint that has done it. Now going back to, Rob, you were talking a bit about the things that happened at the turn of the 70s.
Right.
And the idea was not to take away from, for example, John Lennon's political movements of the very early 70s, not to take away from the fact that, yes, culturally, what John and Geraldo Rivera and everybody did by putting together the one-to-one concert, that did have a big effect on something very human. Even arguably the John Sinclair rally and then John Sinclair being freed was a heads up to the powers that be that maybe this sending people to jail for 2 joints was gonna be problematic going forward.
Well, I think it helped it, but I also think that just on a more John Lennon thing, that the fact that John Sinclair gets out 2 days later set him up for what happened in 1972.
Absolutely.
One-to-one, sometime in New York City, the anti-Nixon rallies, the fact that he almost was going to go on a tour, to help raise money and awareness for the Democratic Party, or at least be anti-Nixon in 72, who knew he was going to win 49 states. But I think that's part of, that success led to John thinking, okay, we can do more of this. I often wondered if it wasn't a success, would have John, thought of it maybe differently.
And
but here's
contrary-wise, though, Rob, if you think about it, had somehow John not somehow so gravely inspired Nixon's ire that
Right.
he was going to go for the jugular, would John continuing on as a political artist, if that was scared out of his system, if it became, wow, I can't keep doing this because they're out to get me now. If John had stayed and every once in a while kept throwing his politics out there, would John have maybe continued to have been something of a potential political cultural influence? Is that possible?
I think he was, but I think, what happens is, he was anti-Nixon, but it didn't stop Nixon from winning.
Right.
And we all know what happened the night, the election night, where John takes I forgot who the woman was, and takes her into another room and makes love to her, making sure that everyone in the other room who he was with, including Yoko, knew that he was having sex with this woman. It was a personal, purposely done thing.
Yeah.
But I also think that, part of the whole thing with Nixon was in 2 years, Nixon's gone. But John Lennon sort of gave up the politics. Mind Games doesn't really have, except for Free to People, which I think is a great political song, doesn't have really it's more looking inside of John Lennon again instead of looking outside and seeing the world.
And now look at Walls and Bridges. Now you've got
yes, exactly.
But
Go ahead.
if we're talking about influences, then when John stopped, did his political awareness to the world influence others to take up the mantle and do it? No.
Who? Right. That's what I mean. Who?
Right. No one did.
Same.
So he wasn't. He even himself said in 1979 or 80 he was a phony radical. So
Which I don't believe. I think he just said that. I don't think he was phony about it.
I agree, but I think he was 40 now, and 39 or 40, and was past
Or maybe
that.
he was trying to keep the Reagan administration off his ass.
Maybe that. Yeah, you know what? That might be true too.
You got to remember, when he came back, he wanted to be, embraceable John Lennon. He didn't really.
Well, he was older and a lot wiser.
But a lot of the stuff in the Playboy interview is very political. It just
Yes.
that it didn't get picked up on.
Right.
Nobody saw him marching down the streets or at Attica, in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, not Attica, but and wherever he was singing, Give Peace a Chance. Nobody took up the Give Peace a Chance mantle because John Lennon had done it. So that's what we're saying in this show. If he had stopped in 71 or 2 or even maybe early 73, and some other band, let's just say Zeppelin, for argument's sake, picked up a political mantle, you say, wow, John Lennon influenced them. But no one else did it. So
again,
as far as that, he wasn't the cultural influence in the 70s. When John Lennon spoke in the 60s, everybody listened.
Yes.
Now again, I don't.
But that doesn't really happen till after 68, though.
You're right.
The politics
And I don't
side
know
of
if
him comes
that's-
out.
Wait a
when
minute.
it's Yoko.
There was that Jesus thing.
Yeah, but that was misinterpretation, and
It was, but it was still.
but that started the whole thing where John said, well, if I'm going to be misinterpreted, I want to be misinterpreted the way I want to be interpreted. So
Right.
if you look at 66, that whole time, I've been going through press conferences and stuff, part of my show, and this other project I'm doing. If you look at, they asked John, but a lot of times Paul would give the answer, like he was protecting John from being nailed to the cross, so to speak. And it's something I didn't realize until I started to do this project, that Paul is protecting John in many ways because he's the one answering the questions, not John.
But here's the thing also. Let's go back to a little bit of fashion, if you don't mind, because I was thinking about it, and maybe I'm wrong and maybe I'm right. I don't know. Tell me.
You're wrong.
Well, now you sound like my wife. You sound like my wife. Not you, Rob. The wrong one.
Oh, okay.
But John's like green jacket look, with that political, with the regular
71,
army
71,
team.
72.
Yeah, that I think that was picked up by a lot of people.
Was John just doing it because
I was thinking of that too, but
Right.
I'm trying to think, and I tried to find that look prior. I don't know if he started it.
My sister's friend Kenny looked like that when I was 5 and 6 in 1970 and 71. He was
Okay, I was about to say. So look,
an
whether he was
architect.
whether, but you know what? If even if John picked it up from somewhere else, I think a lot of people saw John in that jacket, and then it may have
Yeah,
influenced fashion in a little bit. And I think his glasses too. I don't think the 60s glasses. I'm talking about the round 70s glasses.
well,
I
the
think those
National Health
also.
classes he had for a while. That
He
was
had
he had that in the 60s as well, the
he
National
had
Health.
it starting in 66.
Yeah,
So
but
I know.
you know,
I think the
but I mean,
whole look though.
I think again, you know, going to the cultural thing and going to back to the early 70s and bringing it back again. Citing a few things that were highly influential and
Go
still
ahead.
going past the early 70s. You absolutely must, because we're celebrating, as of this recording, we're celebrating the 40-year anniversary, but you have to give the concert for Bangladesh
Correct.
its influence. You know,
The influence.
the influence that it had on popular culture. It would you have ever had, you know, I don't know, maybe you would have but would you have had a Live Aid, you know, however many years later, had there not been a concert for Bangladesh? Would you have had, you know, would you have even had a one-to-one concert if there had not been you know, oh no, one-to-one was first. Right. So I don't know.
No, it wasn't.
Bangladesh in
August of
71.
71 and then 72.
Yeah, Bangladesh was first. So would you
But
have
you're right, Tony. Here's
bought
here's
it
the
and then
thing.
it went like that? Anyway.
Here's the thing. The 60s had plenty of quote festivals and pop
But that's
festivals.
different. A
Right.
festival is different than a big fundraising.
Well, that's where I'm going. Because
Yeah.
people are going to start saying, but wait, there were plenty of festivals and stuff that had a million great artists. That's
Bangladesh
true.
wasn't a festival. It was just a
Right.
late.
It was just a right. It was just a you play music and you enjoy it, turn on, turn out, whatever. But Bangladesh started the charitable aspect of it all, where people got together for a specific reason to help something, whether it was Ethiopia, you know, like Live Aid, whether it was Bangladesh, you know, whether it's the Princess Trust to help kids, you know. I think Bangladesh, certainly George in that regard, was definitely influential throughout not only the 70s, but to today.
Yeah, I agree. And Bob Geldof has mentioned that, George's, the setting that he made for Concert for Bangladesh, influenced him. And, yeah, remember that also there was a movie, there was a record, there wasn't a book, but there probably should have been. And I think that's part of it too. So you do an event and then make it bigger by having the movie, having the record. Woodstock, everyone talks about Woodstock, but if Woodstock didn't have the movie and the record and everything else, no one would remember it. It would have been the New York Pop Festival
Right.
or something like that. And
Right.
same with Monterey Pop. They film it and then they release it, and then you say, okay, this is how I remembered. People say, "Oh, I was at Woodstock." No, you weren't. You saw the movie in the theater. You got stoned. So to me,
I thought you were there.
yeah, you thought you were there. So to me, I
You
think that's
walked
part
outside, got some mud on your boot, and you thought, "Oh yeah, I was at Woodstock,
That
man."
was
Yeah, it
weird.
rained outside of the theater afterwards. You got water in your popcorn that you were taking home. But that's to me what George did in 71 with the concert for Bangladesh made it so other acts could follow this you know thing that George had started. Now other Live Aid was much bigger. It was on two continents. Had
Different
all
doesn't matter. He
but they
started
also oh yeah, he started it. And I always look, it was just recently, it was the 40th anniversary of Live Aid. And one thing I realized, no one did a George Harrison song. It's like, here's George Harrison, we're going to do Living in the Material World, which would have been a very appropriate
Well,
song.
George was asked to be there.
Yeah, I know that, but some band could have said, let's do a George Harrison song. You know, so I think that's part of it. So, you know, I think when, you know, we talk about the 70s and there was a lot of other things, you know, doing a concert like that is different. It sets up so many other things. It's not just, you know, George even wrote Bangladesh, you know, but nowadays, if he had written Bangladesh, he would have like all the great artists who were, you know, you would have a line by Leon Russell, let's say,
Yeah,
you know, the
Band-Aid
artist.
or
Right.
USA for Africa.
Exactly. So, you know, did write the song, but it was a George Harrison song. Nowadays, it would be more of a group thing. And, you know, Mitch, you were talking about Give Peace a Chance before. You know, in 1969, it was very appropriate because of what was going on in Vietnam. It doesn't seem like it's going to end. And the line of Give Peace a Chance is such a great line because it's saying, instead of saying give war a chance, give peace a chance. But in 1991, when they redid the song, I still remember this article in Billboard magazine. You know, they did the whole thing. Well, we'll get all the superstars on it. We'll get Lenny Kravitz. We'll get a lot of other people on the record. And there was an article in Billboard about the record because, you know, how can you not play it? And there were program directors saying, well, you know, it's not the 70s anymore. You know, it's not the 60s anymore. You know, we're afraid of, like, you know, stirring anything up here. And that song barely charted, you
Well, you
know?
said
So,
radio changed.
Yeah, then that's part of it too. So, you know,
yep.
the chance of, you know, why wasn't that song as you know, the Peace Choir who did it? Why wasn't that like a huge hit? They made a video, they made, you know, everyone did it for charity.
Because peace, even Ringo with his Peace and Love today is still chanting pretty much give peace a chance.
Sure, it's his
So you
version
know
of it,
what?
yeah.
Listen, and we just this is so weird. Maybe John did influence the world. I mean, he influenced Ringo.
Of
I
course he
mean,
influenced the
because
world.
no, I mean with Give Peace a Chance, because
Oh,
even throughout the 70s and 80s, because Ringo's still doing it today. And you know what? If Give Peace a Chance is still on, you know, I mean, there's memes of Give Peace a Chance, and
right, yeah.
but still, you know, there's still shirts that are made today with Give Peace a Chance.
Again, guys, listen to where we are.
Yep,
Still not left 1972.
I know.
So I mean,
Understood.
what I keep coming back to, and Rob, you brought up a few good points, which are points that I wanted to kind of drive home. Things that were gone in the 70s. One thing that was gone was the fact that we had one radio dial as our primary source of music. Now we had the FM dial. Okay. Now FM was proliferating. Now FM was getting big. Now FM let in all of the rock and roll bands that weren't necessarily message driven, that weren't necessarily out to change culture, that were out to sort of play their long jams, play their artistic compositions, do what they did. You didn't have a concentrated FM dial. You didn't have that dividing line of the graduating class. You didn't have young people listening to hit radio, growing up with a band. You now had sort of a division.
Yeah.
It was the group listening to AM, the group listening to FM. There wasn't usually a gradual move. We were sort of the last generation to really do that, move from AM to FM. You listen to ABC, and then maybe you listen to 99X, and then you on FM, and you know, here in New York, and then you drifted to WNEW, and but radio didn't have the impact. Radio still had the impact it had in the 70s that it did in the 60s, but not in the same way. You didn't have the Casey Kasums, the Cousin Bruceys, the good guys, you didn't have that in the 70s the way you did in the 60s. You didn't have NEW had a following, and NEW was affecting, but NEW was kind of like here in New York was like the hippie culture, you know, which already pre-existed. They weren't bringing in new things to move and shake. Gone also was the Ed Sullivan Show, and there was nothing that replaced it.
Nothing.
Well, that's when you start getting the spread, where
Bingo.
The main what we call a mainstream, which is such a overused term now. But back then, you had the Sullivan Show. You knew every Sunday you were going to get, a rock and roll act and maybe a guy juggling and, maybe
Right.
Steve and Edie come on and sing a song or whatever. Everything was set up. And that's part of it too. Yeah, I agree with that part where and I wish Pete Fornatale was still around. I know he's been on he was on this show. Tony, you worked with him for many years.
Yeah.
He talked about this a lot because, at the end of the 70s, people forget that FM got really reduced playlists, from what
Absolutely.
Pete was playing and all the
Absolutely.
other NEW jocks. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden, it's like, he's like, well, why can't I play the Beach Boys on a rock station? And they're like, well, the Beach Boys aren't cool anymore. Well, they still make great music, and Pete would play it on his show, but it wasn't part of the playlist. And I think that was just part of it. I think, one of the things I really loved about the One-to-One movie that came out a few months ago, that it included John and Yoko in the time. So from 71 to 72, it's over that time. And then they include songs from the One-to-One concert, which, by the way, I'm waiting for that release. It sounded and looks so good compared to the 80s version. But by putting John and Yoko not as the only focus, but as part of the focus of what was going on, they had like commercials in this, and they had tapes of you could hear the FBI listening in on John and Yoko, and you hear clicks in the background and stuff, and they even showed politics, which a lot of it is the same crap that's happening today. So by putting John and Yoko not as the main focus, but as the overall focus, it really showed you what was going on politically in 71 and 72. I was very impressed with that idea because we always get John and Yoko, were leading the way. Well, there was other people too, and they were part of it. And John and Yoko would both say that, but a lot of people don't.
But to Tony, back to Tony's point for one sec. There was no show, I don't care, rock concert, midnight special, I don't care, in the 70s that you could be on that 73 million people were going to watch, no matter what band you were.
Right.
Right.
Nothing. So,
And even, oh, go ahead. Sorry, Mitch.
no, I was going to say, it's a great point, Tony, because, and Rob, because, Ed Sullivan, as you said, Rob, you watched Ed Sullivan and you knew a new band was coming on. You didn't know if you were going to like them or not, but you heard something great. If you heard, wow, the Starland Vocal Band are going to be on Midnight Special, a rock concert tonight, 73 million people didn't care.
No, I went to bed, actually. I went to sleep early that night, actually.
And funny enough,
I was working up an appetite, but it wasn't for watching that. Anyway.
Are you done?
Yeah.
Wow,
Right now I could go
nice
drink
little,
some brandy.
nice little
I could drink some brandy.
Thank you.
No, but you know what? Through a looking glass. But honestly, like oddly enough, the biggest appearances were like by the Bee Gees, who did Beatles medleys. Oddly enough.
Well, but
there was no show that really broke an artist like
there was.
the 60s.
There was, but it was
What?
different, and that's to the point. It's again back to culture shifted.
Right.
The way culture was presented to young people and old people was a divisiveness. There was a generation gap. That generation gap was established. Younger people were established as a market. You were catering to younger people. Let's face it, the midnight special was on because everybody was coming into the house after being out in the evening being stoned. They rolled into the house and they watched the freaking midnight special, just like they watched Saturday Night Live and had their minds blown by Kate Bush and by Devo and by all the bands that appeared.
Andy Kaufman.
Andy,
It was after prime time, though.
It was after prime time. So what you were doing was you were essentially preaching to the choir to get the choir to go out and buy something. You were commercially don't get me wrong, Lorne Michaels wanted to turn people on to Kate Bush. It wasn't like, we're going to go have her on the show so people buy Kate Bush records. He saw Kate Bush and went, oh my God, we got to have her on the show. She's awesome. Let's turn the world on to this amazing woman, but it wasn't about shaking. And not that Ed Sullivan wanted to shake up culture by having the Beatles on, but Ed Sullivan knew he had lightning in a bottle. He knew
Well, he did too in the 50s with Presley.
and he knew it with Presley. And so the idea is nobody was going out there thinking in the back of their mind that they had even half of 73 million people.
But he also alienated all the adults, and meaning, the adults, not the teenage kids who were tuning in 11:30, and the young kids. So it was a different time because, again,
Lauren Michaels, you're talking about Saturday.
well, I'm just saying, and all the after primetime shows.
I just meant you because it sounded like you were going back to Sullivan, so I want to make sure.
Well, I'm sort of going there because now hear me out, because the all the shows, Saturday Night Live, Midnight Special, Rock Concert, they were on 11 or 11:30 or whatever. They were alienating even the little teeny boppers who prior were watching Sullivan in primetime and were establishing that quote mania. So there was no show that was going to establish a mania of the sort of the 60s type in the 70s. It just wasn't the same time. So I don't think again, as much as the Beatles were a big influence and had the mania, I don't think they could have been an influence in the 70s because, again, there was no vehicle for any other band to be like the Beatles or explosiveness or even influenced by the Beatles in terms of mania in the 70s.
I've got a double-edged question.
Sure.
Did the resurgence, two-part question, did the resurgence of the Beatles' popularity itself, starting in 73 with the Red and the Blue, jumping to 76 again with rock and roll music and the Bill Sargent offers and all that stuff.
And Got to Get You Into My Life going to number 7.
Right.
God.
Well, that was partly because of Paul touring.
I know, but it's still.
But did the resurgence of the Beatles' popularity continually and ongoing through the 70s inhibit the solo Beatles from really being able to get out of their own way? Did it stop them from being able to really go ahead and do something possibly experimental or possibly, wow, that's groundbreaking, because they were constantly in competition with themselves?
Yes and no.
I agree with what Witch is about to say.
Yes and no, because yes and no, because the Beatles were idiots. How's that? Did you agree with that? No, I'm kidding.
No, I don't.
No.
With that.
Yes and no, because the resurgence only led kids to them again. Okay. And the kids who were now, born 10 years later are now experiencing the Beatles like the kids in 64 did. Now I'm talking states-wise. I know they were huge in 63 in England. So, and we're talking more US centric here for now. But I think 10 years later, almost exactly 10 years later, when the Beatles resurgence hit, all those quote teeny boppers now were a little older and were finding the Beatles again. So in terms of that, the Beatles were influential on every generation, even in the 70s.
But again, though, Mitch,
I'm going back to what you were going to say. Yes, they did sort of inhibit each one of them, but I really feel, and this is just my opinion, I really feel that because the Beatles were so big again, it didn't really inhibit, but I think it only opened the door once again for the solo Beatles to take advantage of that popularity and then try to experiment, which really none of them did, except I'm going to say George. George always, he did nothing that sounded Beatle-y until 87. He avoided the Beatles sound. I mean, look at 76 with Woman Don't You Cry For Me. Ringo never did a beat like that, okay? He purposely stayed away from the Beatle-y sound. So he was trying. It didn't work.
Right.
but I don't think they were really. Yes, they were competing against themselves, but only in a good way, in my point of view. You're bringing it up as if it was a negative.
Yeah, well,
Against
because
them.
again, I'm saying, from I don't know if you want to say a psychological standpoint. I mean, obviously that's pure speculation, but it's the idea that, if everything I did 7 years ago is becoming a hit again, what's going to drive me forward to say I can do better than that? I can I,
Well,
I can do something new and exciting and explosive, and I'm gonna try this weird thing
Yeah,
that
but do you have to do something weird like that? I mean, think about the Beatles. You know, they changed the world, and okay, well, you change the world. How do you change it again? Well, maybe you don't have to. Look at the fact that Ringo, you know, basically went back to being Ringo instead of trying, some of the bad albums he made in the late '70s.
it's tough
What
for a
what
drummer,
what
though.
what did John Lennon say to Andy Newmark during the Double Fantasy sessions?
Play
Play it
like
like
Ringo.
Ringo.
right.
Now he could have said, "Well, let's get Ringo in here," but he didn't. But he said, "Play it like Ringo," because what's happened is the Beatles have become almost a shorthand, not just for the Beatles themselves, but for all musicians. They know the music. You can say, "Okay, play this like this," and we know if you say, "Hey, let's do what they did on Pepper," they bounce tracks or whatever if you're a musician. Nowadays, you don't have to do that anymore, but that's part of the whole thing. You know, McCartney makes McCartney 2, and everyone's like, "What the hell's Paul doing?" And now everyone says, "Well, that album was actually pretty ahead of its time." But at the time, they're like, "Paul, what's wrong with you?
But think about it
We
though.
like the live coming up, not this studio thing. What's the sequence of doing on Temporary Secretary?
But
I
think
love that."
right. But think about it though. Paul was not breaking ground there, but it is interesting. There was sort of a cultural influence from Paul with that because it was mainstreaming. It's
Yes,
back
and
to that idea of mainstreaming. Cultural change can involve mainstreaming. So I was looking at McCartney 2, which is right at the end of the 70s.
Yeah.
I'm going to toss another big cultural change or big effect that a Beatle had on culture in the late 70s.
Go ahead.
And I'll drop the name of which one, and I'll let you guys go. A huge influence on culture was made by George Harrison, and it was made in 1979.
Hang on.
Influence on culture.
Influence on culture in 79.
Influence on popular culture, I'd say, in
It
a
doesn't have to do with Formula One racing or anything.
not at all, but you're getting warmer because it has nothing to do with music.
Really?
It's Life of Brian
Oh, movies,
movie.
okay, well,
manufacturing, and yeah.
That was George Harrison's big end of the 70s. I'm going to have a major influence on culture.
But a little bit back for Holy Grail, that was financed by people like Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So he wasn't leading in that, but
He wasn't right.
he
Right.
did influence, but he wasn't leading the charge as if the Beatles did in the 60s for every freaking step of the way.
Yeah, yes, that's true.
but you gotta remember when the Beatles led in the '60s, they also were influenced by Chuck Berry and Little Richard and all these people before them that people maybe by that time in '64, '65, or in '63, if you want to talk about Great Britain, had forgotten about. We're talking about only a few years, the difference, but things changed. So Life of Brian also, and I never thought of this until literally just we're talking, sort of represents George's attitude towards religion. It's more about the spiritual thing, not about the crowdsourcing, so to speak.
Right.
Where what you are in the movie, which is Chapman. You're our savior. And he goes, no, no, I'm not. Whatever. So I think that I never thought of it until you just mentioned it. That George getting involved was, sort of, um, horse to the water, if you think about it. When he talks about religion and horse to the water, which happened to be his last release song. It was always more about the spirituality than the physical God part. And I think that's part of it. That's a good point. He changed his life because in the 80s, after John gets murdered, he just walks away and he just basically becomes a producer. He helped save the British film industry. I've read that and heard that more than a few times.
That'll
Absolutely.
be our next show, how the Beatles influenced the 80s.
Well, the 80s were a different time because,
Again,
because one thing about, I just want to bring us back to 1973.
sure.
Each Beatle had a big hit or several hits in 1973. The fact that the Red and the Blue album sort of refocused it on the Beatles, even though it's only you think about it, it's only 3 years before since they'd broken up. But the way the music business worked back then, it was record and singles. It's not like today where you wait 3 years for another record. So
The ink on the breakup contract was not only not dry, it wasn't even signed yet.
right. So and that's part of it too. So to me, 1973, the Red and the Blue, which brought in so many new fans to the Beatles because that's maybe the two records they get first. From now on, if you started to be a Beatles fan, let's say you're 13 or 14 in 1977, like me, what do you get first? You get the Red and the Blue albums, even though I actually got the Beatles on the Hollywood Bowl first.
Well,
But
now you would get Beatles 1.
right, you'd get Beatles 1, and that was released purposely as a 1 CD set, not a 2 CD set, because it's much cheaper. So there are times, you're right. Beatles 1 is the starting point. But at that time in the 70s, it was the Red and the Blue albums.
But
And
Tony, you brought up something, Tony, off mic, which I think we need to talk about. We were talking about, the Rob said the CBGB scene and punk, and you were talking about the Ramones, Tony.
Yeah, well, where I was going was that what type of music had an influence on culture, and more so in the UK, but here in the big cities, here in New York, punk and the punk movement had a very big effect on New York, on the New York scene, on culture, on in the Great Britain, certainly, because a lot that was going on politically over there. So the argument is, okay, well, punk was the big thing that well, guess what? Punk in the UK was brought about because of, in some claim, was when the Ramones went over to the UK to go play at the Roundhouse. And that's what brought punk to England. And the Ramones were named after Paul McCartney's pseudonym. The Ramones were, even though the joke was that Glenn Matlock was thrown out of the Sex Pistols for saying that he liked the Beatles, which was a load of crap. But the Ramones were just wanted to play the Beach Boys sped up. That's what and wanted to play Saturday Night by the Bay City Rollers. The next Beatles, them. And the Ramones were big Beatles freaks.
They love the Beatles.
So arguably, here's the funny part, the big thing that was the other music that changed culture in the 70s was a direct throwback to the Beatles influence. So here it is, kind of all coming around again in a package. We don't have to round up, but we probably should start to get ready to round up. But here's the humor, where or the irony, and that's why I said this is not to be down on the solo Beatles, but the Beatles influence itself, my feeling, was so strong and so, if there's such a word as reverberative, it reverberated so deeply and for such a long time and with such tentacles and such force that it continued to be the cultural influence throughout the 70s. The Beatles themselves, the Beatles as a group, almost not really, the solo Beatles, it's not that they didn't have room to be influential, but Rob, your statement at the very beginning, I think is the key point. The door had already been kicked down. That was so well done.
You can't re-kick it down. Once something happens, it becomes part of the whole future. in a way when you look back. And nowadays, when you talk about the Beatles, what do they talk about? They go, how did they do it with a 4-track? How did they do this? How did they record this into that with a 4-track? And because there's so many, the way you record is so different now. So to me, what happens is as we get older, we drag this history with us, and sometimes the history gets disconnected and left behind. The Beatles haven't been left behind, and I even think into the 70s when they were doing different things, they weren't, we could do a show of songs that the solo Beatles did that could have been Beatles songs, but songs that the solo Beatles did that couldn't be Beatles songs.
Oh, absolutely.
So, so I think that's part of, that could be a future show, but there are certain songs that don't, wouldn't be a Beatles song.
I mean,
And part of it is the 4 of them in the room. Could John have sang Mother in front of the other 3? I don't know. But, because they knew his mother. Well, they met his mother.
Absolutely. But he possibly could have, and again, it's back to that 70, 71, 72, when their influence was still felt so strongly on one another.
Sure.
And it's that idea, and you bring about, another good point too, Rob, is that as, as songwriters, they had one another. John and Paul had one another to bounce off of throughout the Beatle years. Alone, and even they were writing to impress one another. They were writing to one up themselves. I think there was a feeling in the 70s as solo artists that even though Paul was always forever trying to better himself, and Paul wrote some great songs, do at 30 that maybe I'm not going to write another Yesterday. I might write another great song, and I might write another influential song. I might write a song that gets covered by a few hundred people, but am I ever going to write another Yesterday?
Yeah, but also, part of Yesterday was it was released as a single here in the States and wasn't until 76 in Great Britain. But at the same time, how many covers? It's just over 3,000 covers of that. Now, I think there have been better songs than Yesterday, but Paul's written.
I actually agree.
But how do you judge a song's impact if you just look at the sheet music? It's really tough to do.
Absolutely. But where I'm going is, how do you judge an impact? Well, and again, it's but a cultural impact of 3,000 people.
Right. And I just want to get back to what I was talking about with the song Mother. John wrote Julia, which is much more, I don't want to say a romantic look at the person who is his mother and what he was going through at the time with Yoko. It's a much different song, and he did record it, but at the time, no one knew really who Julia was, unless maybe you've read the Hunter Davies book.
That's true too.
So, there is a difference. I mean, if you want to look at the Beatles versus the solo Beatles, you can say Julia versus Mother, in many ways, because they just looked at life a little bit different when the 4 of them weren't in the same room, and I think that's just part of it. It's just, even like sometime in New York City and Wings Wildlife, have similar things that they needed some editing from.
But can you talk about cultural importance and look at and look at the lyrics to She's Leaving Home versus Down in the Jungle, living in a tent, you don't use money, you don't pay rent. I mean?
Right, but also, they had to put out more songs as solo artists.
True that.
So maybe maybe Down in the Jungle was written in 1968 or something, but he goes, well, but what am I talking about here? Well, we'll just leave that here.
Pull that
and
out.
Some songs did come out after the Beatles broke up. Teddy Boy and Jealous Guy was originally Child of Nature. So, it's tough to tell because, just looking at music, I was just listening to Cousin Brucey as was coming in here tonight, and he was talking about the song that became popular on TikTok of Connie Francis. He was doing a tribute to Connie Francis, and I think it's called Little Baby or something like that.
Yeah, I forgot what it was.
And he had talked to her a few weeks earlier, and she goes, Bruce, I don't even remember doing the song.
Right.
And now this is going to be the song that people remember her by because it was on TikTok. So
The damn guitar solo and Lipstick on Your Collar. It's one of the guitar solos in the history of rock and roll, man. Serious. Not
but you're
kidding. Go listen.
but
Do it now.
but you're right. You're right. But think about it. I just don't understand. The Beatles cover Anne Margaret. Why? And then if you actually listen to the song, you say,
Great
"Oh
song.
yeah, I can see why they covered it."
Anyway.
But getting back to the topic at hand, I would love to sit there and say, and this is the last I'll talk.
No.
I would love to say that a drummer said, Ringo's drumming on Living in the Material World just blew me away and influenced me. I would love to hear someone say Paul's bass from Silly Love Songs influenced me. So far we've said that the slide guitar was a big influence on musicians, but
And to your point,
Ringo's drumming, Paul's bass playing, John's guitar playing, nothing really influenced like when people say John's right hand in the 60s was the best freaking thing for rhythm guitar players, it was the beginning of that whole guitars are in. And so in the 70s, everybody was doing it already. So musically, I don't think the Beatles influenced anything in terms of their instruments except the slide guitar.
Well, we did talk about that too, Mitch. Don't forget, we were
Right.
saying Paul did appear on many, many, many of the polls as
Yes, but
best bass.
yes, he's of course going to be on the polls. But did you ever hear anybody say his bass playing on Junior's Farm or in Wings influenced me? No, but you heard them say, "My God, listen to I Saw Her Standing There, listen to Penny Lane," or Taxman or something. Nobody said that later on about any of the Beatles except the slide guitar part.
You do hear it now and again. I do hear music. I hear younger musicians now, and I'm being very upfront. Now that we've gone over to the era of Spotify and where you can get tracks thrown at you that you don't really know where they originate from and what they are. You may know they're not Beatles songs, but I do hear young musicians say, "Wow, McCartney's always been a hell of a bass player."
Yes, always been, but in the 70s,
Yeah.
now you hear that, and especially since Get Back, because Get Back really showed them creating.
Yes.
So everybody now, all the young kids are going, "Oh my God, the Beatles were the biggest freaking influence in the world." And Get Back showed it and helped show that. But at the point of 70 to 80, nobody was really sitting there saying, everybody was still saying the Beatles are the number one group ever, and that's fine because they were from the 60s. But nobody, if you would have said who's the greatest group of the 70s, nobody was putting any individual Beatle at the top.
No, and yet the Beatles were still on some polls.
Yes, correct. But nobody was sitting there going, Paul McCartney is the best artist. Paul had the best solo career and probably had, other than Elton John, had more hits in the 70s than anybody.
Elton was number one in the 70s. Paul
Right,
was number
I know.
two.
Paul was number two. Well, Wings made a lot of, again, it's that difference, as we were talking about, Mitch, the difference between a lot of sales versus influence.
Correct. And I know, but the influence, again, other than Bangladesh, Slide, obviously, it's so funny that George is really the only one we're mentioning that had a cultural impact throughout the 70s. Other than that, again, this is not disparaging the Beatles or each solo Beatle. They were amazing in the 70s, but the times were different, as we've established, and they just didn't have the, quote, influence that they did 10 years earlier.
You're not going to capture lightning twice in a bottle.
And that's the point of the show as well.
Yeah. But also, another thing that George did that, which I just thought about, think about world music. George playing the sitar, not just on the Beatles stuff, but he does Wonderwall, and then
he didn't use a sitar in the 70s, though.
I know, but
nothing.
He allowed at the concert for Bangladesh for Ravi Shankar to play.
But again, that's Bangladesh.
And then he allowed him in 74, and just think about in 3 years the acceptance and all the smoke that was seen at the Madison Square Garden when Ravi Shankar played, compared to 74, where people are saying, why is he up there playing like this 45 minutes set? But George was just doing the same thing he had done with the concert from Bangladesh. You know, the same setup. And I think that's part of it. You know, even you think about that 3-year change. You know, the acceptance more in 71, where 74 there was acceptance, but it's like, well, I'd rather hear more George.
Right.
You know, so
Right.
I think times change, and if you think about the Beatles, 64 to 68 is really their time. 69, well, was a great time, but they were starting to break up by then, and music had changed by then too. Radio had changed by then. FM had come in, at least in the States. Even top 40 stations, were playing like album tracks of the Beatles.
Yeah.
I was listening to this Cousin Brucey air check, and he played every little thing. And he goes, "This is from Beatles 6, and you heard it exclusively on WABC." Well, yeah, because it wasn't a hit, but they played it anyway. And a lot of other stations, jumped on Rubber Soul, especially from what
I often wonder. I often wonder, what if the Beatles accepted the Bill Sargent $50 million offer?
Oh, it would have been
Even if
horrible.
it was just a one-off concert.
Again, it would have been
I know.
Huge thing.
A awful thing for that moment.
But if the Beatles had all walked on stage wearing yellow shirts and red energy domes like Devo,
right? Would people have gone out and buy them? No.
Right.
No. Well, we don't know.
You don't know. So there you go. It's the kind of thing, oh, look, the Beatles are all coming out in just their jock straps. Woo!
I have to go buy a jock strap.
To go buy a jock strap, and I'm not going to wear my pants to work anymore. I don't know. But
I don't know.
But again, because again, now it was the Beatles doing it as opposed
not the
to
solo.
John and just Paul. And I mean, I had somebody say to me the other day, well, Paul, like they were trying to think of things. Paul, listen to what the man said. That was like New Orleans music. Yeah, well, so was Rockin' Pneumonia and the Boogie Woogie Flu 2 years.
And Alan Toussaint was doing it well before.
And Yes We Can by the Pointer Sisters.
Yeah.
So, he
took the torch and did it well, but he didn't lead the charge.
Right.
Like the Beatles, again, different times. You can't, as you said, Rob, perfect ending to the show. You can't catch lightning in a bottle twice. I mean, I think it's a great ending to the show.
I think also just the fact that the four of them had success in the 70s. The four of them, I think, is just tremendous in the fact that the talent of these guys, that they were able to do separate things and have hits. They all had #1 hits during this time. I often wondered, what would have happened if John didn't retire in 75, where he took his step away, which I understand why he did it.
Yeah.
But I often wonder what would have happened, because, the other three still made music, but it wasn't the same. After 75, after they signed the contract to end it, sort of things changed a little bit. So, and also John said this in an interview, he asked about, they always ask, any Beatle about, well, will they get back together? And John says, well, if we did, I'm not sure I would want to do a concert, but I would like to do a studio thing.
Yes.
And I think that's part of it too. The Beatles became this great studio band. When we talk about the Beatles live, okay, it's nice, 11 songs or 12 songs at the Hollywood Bowl or whatever. But, if they kept doing that, do they do Pepper? Do they do the White Album? Do they do Abbey Road? I don't know.
They go to the Bill Sargent show and do the entire Sgt. Pepper album live. Anyway.
Yeah, on that note.
Well, at that point, they probably could have done it because the technology was there.
Yeah.
Well, in our congratulatory messages to folks like, the Knack, the Bay City Rollers, ELO, everyone who was the next Beatles in the 70s. Thanks for
our condolences, by the way.
And our condolences to you.
But we like those bands. We like the Knack.
No, but too many bands got stuck with being, quote, the next Beatles, and they never were.
And having to survive the influence of the Beatles in the 70s, and the fact that, their records still...
Holly, you just said something, Mitch. I know we're going to try to end this, but, you mentioned the next Beatles, but that term turned into Beatlesque.
That's true.
Later, yes.
they don't say the next Beatles, but Matthew Sweet is Beatlesque, which I love Matthew Sweet. Don't get me wrong.
No,
I'm
but-
not sure he is Beatlesque.
But that started after the 70s.
Yes,
Right.
and Beatlesque is a comment on the music, which is often quite positive.
Yes.
The problem with the next Beatles is it was a hype thing that often, as much as they killed the band.
Right. And
Right.
Beatlesque also means you're not really doing good on the charts.
Right.
Because and that's the other thing too. Music now is hip hop mostly. I don't see Paul. Well, he did.
What parties are you going to that music is still mostly hip hop?
Well, not me, not club music.
hip hop is
if you listen to Top 40 or something. I mean, Paul
Rob's
had to do
still
a song.
stuck at his party with the White Album. Come
yeah,
on.
no,
Hey,
they're playing Taylor Swift at the parties now, Rob. There's the hip hop is
Well,
play at
Paul,
certain parties.
Paul did that song with Rihanna, so at least he got a top 10 thing out of it. But
On that note,
I don't know. It's a tougher thing to look through because one more thing I just had to say. I might do one more thing. But think of the two big bands of the 70s, at least to me. Elton John,
right.
of course, and Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band.
Yeah.
Bruce had a much bigger band than the four-piece band that you normally would be influenced by. And Elton John he's a piano player.
Right.
So he's writing songs just sounding different because he's writing it on a piano all the time.
but he wasn't influenced by the Beatles.
Elton?
It was greatly influenced.
I don't mean it like that. I
From
don't.
a musical standpoint, but I think I know where Rob's going. The bands that were the most influential or the biggest in the 70s were actually quite different from the Beatles.
Yeah, that's part of it too, because the Beatles have already been done. So
Right.
someone else has got to come up. And that's what, where you think about the Ramones, they're tremendously influenced by the Beatles, but their sound didn't sound like the Beatles. But at the same time, if you strip it away, it's the Beach Boys. It's, okay, here's the strum from, some Beatles song or something.
Right.
So, to quote Paul Simon, every generation wants to throw another pop star. No, what was it? Every generation throws another hero off the pop charts. That's it.
There we go.
Something like that.
Anyway, all right. Well, on that note, I want to thank everyone for tuning into this episode of Fab Four Free For All. We've been talking about the Beatles, the solo Beatles, and their effect, or how they folded into the cultural zeitgeist of the 70s. And I want to thank everyone.
One more thing.
What, Ra?
What did John Lennon say about the solo Beatles?
Oh,
He
it's
said
a joke? What did John Lennon say? I don't know. What did John
He
Lennon
said
say?
if you want to make a Beatles album, take four solo songs from John, Paul, George, and Ringo and make an album out of it.
Right, so they influence themselves.
They influenced
Yes. So that I just remembered that line. It was in a Bruce Spicer book. I don't know when the quote was, but you know what? John's right.
He is. And anyway, but that's not cultural, that's music. Anyway,
But that's
all right.
part of it.
so I want to thank everybody for listening here on Fab Four Free For All, and we hope to see you again soon. As always, I would like to thank my friends and co-hosts, Mr. Mitch Axelrod
Take care, folks.
and Mr. Rob Leonard.
Thank you.
And we hope that we will be considered influencers, in a few, in a decade, with podcasts. Who knows?
We
will be the Beatles of the podcast world.
We're going to have 8 billion listeners and subscribers. Of course, we're all going to be, pushing up the flowers. But anyway,
Hold on.
Don't eat the daisies.
yeah,
I've been told twice by 2 different podcasts out there online that we were an influence on them. The Marx Brothers Council, they do a podcast.
shout out to you guys.
And the Zilch podcast said they were definitely influenced by us.
We know and love those guys too. So,
We're monkeys and comedians.
well, there you go. Anyway,
Well, so are the Beatles.
from Groucho, Chico, and Harpo, we love you all, and we'll see you soon. Thank-
Zeppo's not here.
Depot's not here. Take care, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Fab 4 Free For All was edited and produced by Tony Triguardo at Word of Mouth Studios in Westbury, New York.
The opening and closing theme is My Dolly by the band The Badge, featuring longtime listener Jeff Slate, available on its debut album Digital Retro and recent Best Of compilation, as well as from the Fab 4 Free For All website.
Thanks for listening to Fab 4 Free For All.